Hello everybody, I'm your host, Dr. Darkspawn, and welcome to my first Diablo 4 video. Now, this is gonna be a build guide, and I know I'm more of a Meet Your Maker focused content channel, but there's been a bit of a content drought. There were some users that asked for specific builds on outposts for Meet Your Maker, like builds specifically to counter shields, and of course to use trigger setups on Deadman Switch guards effectively. Now, since brutals haven't been getting a lot of raids, and to do these setups you kind of need to be brutal due to the amount of capacity that you require for it to be an actual outpost, instead of it being just one setup and then the rest of the base is just empty, that's a bit of a problem. So I haven't really been able to test these setups in brutal. They've been made, but they haven't been prestiging because they get no raids, and yeah, it's just not a good time. So in this content drought, I have taken the executive decision to go to Diablo 4, and I've a level 52 rogue and a level 60 sorcerer. Now, I'm gonna go over the gear first, and then I'm gonna go over the skill tree and why everything works the way it does. Right, so as for the gear, there are a few important things on this that you really want. Frost Nova gains an additional charge, and the cooldown per charge is increased. The roll on this doesn't really matter. I'm gonna go over the aspects first so that we can see all the legendary aspects and how they tie into the build. This allows us to spam Frost Nova more often, freeze more enemies, generate more ice shards. The chest piece, I have damage and lead, gives me a barrier. It's not a very high level 1, I'm only in world tier 3, but it is adequate for the job that it is doing. I can upgrade this to one that's double the amount, but I want to keep that for a better chest piece that I might find somewhere in the future. The gloves have ice shards pierce enemies 4 times, dealing X% less damage per subsequent enemy hit. This is probably one of the most important aspects. This and Frost Nova are probably the two most important ones on this build. This allows our ice shards that get generated naturally from the enchantment we have on Sorcerer to hit, ricochet, and pierce massive packs of mobs that we group up, and that's what this build is going for. Grouping packs of mobs, mowing them down, and moving on to the next group. For the leg piece, I have casting Ice Armor makes you unstoppable. Having another source of unstoppable or CC break is really important for Sorcerer, because there isn't a lot of that going around in the setup unless you use stuff like Fire Shield or Flame Shield, and that has a really long cooldown on it. Now, with Ice Armor being a good source of 3 seconds of unstoppable here, we can reset half of the cooldown with Deep Freeze. I have the modifier for when Deep Freeze ends, my non-ultimate cooldowns are reduced by 50%. That gives us even less of a cooldown on Ice Armor, so that you're able to more easily reuse this the whole time to increase our uptime of Unstoppable and Barrier. For the boots, I have when I crowd control an enemy, there's an X% chance for that CC effect to spread to another unaffected enemy. This is good for us, not exactly necessary. It just means that a third of the time, every now and then, when I freeze someone, it spreads to the enemy next to them that is unaffected by freeze. It helps get the damage off and the CC off a little bit more effectively, but it's not really too important. For the weapon, I have increased percentile damage demobilized under frozen enemies. This is really great, though it's not exactly necessary. You can have another one on this that boosts your damage or improves your tankiness. It's not the most important thing, but it does really help. For the neck piece, I have when Deep Freeze is active, ice spikes form in the area, exploding for damage, and have a 50% increased explosion radius. Basically, when we use Deep Freeze, this causes these little spikes to erupt in small AoEs around us, as you can see there on the floor. And it does a little bit of extra damage, not 100% necessary again, but it does help with large AoE clearing, especially since you're going to be using Deep Freeze when you have Frost Nova on cooldown. For my rings, I have Avalanche Key passive now applies to 1 additional cast. This is really great for bossing, and this allows us to be able to boss without running out of mana. I have a video where I'm going to fight a Sharp the Pestilent with Tarkus, and you'll be able to see that I was constantly able to have 2 free casts of ice shards and have the ice shards refresh constantly to basically have almost a 70% uptime on the Avalanche key passive free cast with plus 40% damage. You cast Blizzard once and then you just spam Ice Shards. The damage ticks from Blizzard and Ice Shards proc the lucky hit chance on Avalanche, and then you consistently just get free Ice Shards the whole time. For the second ring, I have restore 2 of your primary resource when you crowd control an enemy, aspect of the Umbral. And basically every time I freeze somebody, it gives me plus 2 mana back, and that is extremely useful for upkeeping mana and being able to spam Ice Shards for large packs. Right, for the actual stats on the gear, you really just want elemental resistance and crowd control duration, as well as frost skill damage and cold damage. And ranks to Ice Shards are pretty important, critical chance, and stacking intelligence. Now I have plus 2 ranks to Blizzard here on my leg piece as well. That does help, and basically allows me to take the 2 points that I would have, or 1 point that I would have spent into unlocking Blizzard as a skill, and removing that so I can utilize them in other sections of the build. Percentile damage when killing an elite is also pretty important. It does help a lot with the clearing. Ranks of Ice Armor does also help for increased barrier generation, plus movement speed helps us to clear the dungeons faster and move quicker throughout it. Damage to frozen enemies, imperative. Damage to injured enemies, very good. As soon as they go beneath, I think like 35% health, they count as injured. This gives us massive damage to bosses especially, so what we'll do, we'll cast Blizzard on bosses to slowly have them get staggered, and once they're staggered, mow them down, and once they reach that 35% point, use Frost Nova to make them vulnerable one time, and then you can just hold right click to spam Ice Shards and just delete anything in front of you. For the neck piece, I have mana cost reduction, frost skill damage, and healing received and movement speed. Now, mana cost reduction and frost skill damage is pretty important for this setup, but resistances and damage to frozen, damage to cold, and frost damage is going to be the most important thing you want. Damage to stunned and distant enemies. Distant enemies does help, chilled enemies does help a little bit if you don't have an active freeze on them, or if enemies break out of freeze and become unstoppable. When certain enemies like elites get hit with too many CCs, they become unstoppable for a few seconds, so you can't CC them again. There's a little bit of a timer in between that where you can't do anything much with the setup, but they'll be long dead by that time. And damage to crowd controlled enemies is also a really important setup, and that is why I'm using the staff, because it gives me 35% damage to controlled enemies inherently without needing to have rolled that as a stat. Now I've socketed these with critical strike damage to crowd controlled enemies, and I have critical strike damage as well, and I have quite a bit of critical chance in the setups that I have here, like an extra 9% coming from the gloves. That helps us consistently crit enemies, especially if they're on low health, and especially if we're standing close to them. And with all of the ricochets coming from Ice Shards, it does an insane amount of damage. Yeah, that does it for the gear. Let's hop into the build then. Alrighty then, hopping into the skill tree. Now, a lot of things I've been noticing about the Frost Sorcerer builds is that they either really use the fire enchantment, and then at the end they use the key passive Shatter to group enemies and explode them, and they're not really built around Avalanche or Deep Freeze, so that does give us a weakness that they're not using too many freeze procs, but they're focusing on damage while they have these few freeze procs going down, and they're using some really rare sacred uniques to get the damage off and consistently able to freeze. But what if you don't have that? What if you're like me? You're in World Tier 3, you're just farming, you're getting Paragon points, and you want something that does a ton of freezes and a ton of damage. Now, using the fire damage from Firebolt, we're able to tap into the critical damage nodes on the Pyromancy tree, and going half and half, doing the fire damage as well as doing the freeze procs from some of the free sorcerer builds that I've seen. We can combine these two and we can create an even greater build. Now, I have Frostbolt level 1 with enhanced Frostbolt so that it explodes and deals some AoE damage and chill, and Glinting Frostbolt so we can get some mana back from hitting chilled or frozen enemies, which is important, especially if our RNG is a little unkind to us and we need a bit of mana. For Ice Shards, I put 5 out of 5, and I have +2 coming from my gear. I have Enhanced Ice Shards, so that they have an X% chance to ricochet, and they have a 100% chance to ricochet off of frozen enemies. And Greater Ice Shards, so that when I have a barrier active, they always treat enemies as if they're frozen. This does help a lot when we're going against bosses, because that means whenever we have a barrier up, we're going to be getting all that bonus damage against frozen enemies with Ice Shards. For defensives, I have 3 of 3 for Elemental Attunement, so that there's a lucky hit chance to reset my defensive skills, and we don't have a lot of defensive skills. We have 2 Frost Nova, which has 2 charges on a 27-second cooldown. This does help to refresh those, and Ice Armor, which gives us a ton of barrier and mana regeneration. I have 3 of 3 for Glass Cannon to do more damage and take more damage. Frost Armor, I have 1 point in and +2 coming from the gear. I have Enhanced Ice Armor to just increase the mana generation of the build so that we don't run out of mana more consistently. Frost Nova 5 out of 5 so that it does more damage and that the cooldown is lower. As you can see, the points do decrease the cooldown. It's 28.7 seconds and it goes down to 27.3 seconds just by that 1 point. Now we have 2 charges of this from a piece of gear that we have, which does increase the cooldown of each of the charges by 50%. So if I were to remove that, 50% of this charge cooldown would be reduced, and then the cooldown would be something like 18 or 19 seconds, I think. Enhanced Frost Nova, so that we can reduce the cooldown by up to 4 seconds per cast of Frost Nova for every frozen enemy we kill. Mystical Frost Nova, so that we inflict vulnerability on enemies. The 6-second vulnerability against bosses is great. We really need that to be able to do bosses effectively. In Conjuration, we have Precision Magic, so that we get extra lucky hit chance. That is really important because we do have quite a bit of lucky hit in the setup. We can just find this here. There it is. So we've got lucky hit here to reset our defensives. We have lucky hit here on the bottom, so that it has a chance to give us some mana back anytime we do cold damage against vulnerable enemies, which we will definitely be doing a lot of. Continuing with Conjuration, we have Align the Elements to give us some damage reduction against elites, players as well for PvP, and 3 of 3 for Protection, so that we gain 30% of our life as a barrier for 2 seconds. Barrier uptime helps with treating enemies as frozen from Ice Shards, and also does help our tankiness a massive amount, because we're constantly going to be resetting our defensive cooldowns with Deep Freeze, reducing it by 50% at this point right here on our ultimate cooldowns, and doing a ton of freeze and a ton of damage, using all our charges, resetting our defensive again with Elemental Attunement, and generating even more barrier and even more tankiness, so that we're able to output a lot more damage with Ice Shards. For the mastery skills, I have 1 point in a flame, so that we can unlock Devouring Blaze, which is going to be giving us 30% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies. And as we said before, all enemies are going to be burning because of the Firebolt enchantment. All direct damage from skills apply a burn, and an extra 45% critical strike damage when enemies are immobilized. Now, I think this works with freeze, as freeze count as an immobilize, but I don't know if it's meant to just count as a root, gives the enemy this immobilization damage bonus. But even then, the 30% bonus in itself is massive. For the ultimate skills, I went for Deep Freeze, so we can have 4 seconds of immunity and freeze everything around us and chill everything around us while doing a ton of damage. Prime Deep Freeze, so that we gain 10% of our base life as barrier for 6 seconds each enemy we freeze through the duration of Deep Freeze, and of course Supreme Deep Freeze to give us 50% of our non-ultimate cooldowns back. I went 3 out of 3 for Fury Surge to give us, killing a burning enemy gives us increased mana regeneration, 30% for 3 seconds for each enemy we kill that burns. Again, we'll be applying a lot of burn from the Firebolt enchantment, from all direct damage, so this is constantly going to be active. Permafrost, so that we deal increased damage to elites. Hoardfrost 3 of 3, so you can get increased damage to chilled and frozen enemies. Icy Touch maxed as well to increase our cold damage to vulnerable enemies, and we're going to be applying a lot of vulnerability with Frost Nova and Frigid Breeze, because we're stacking lucky hit in this build anyway. We're going to be doing a lot of cold damage against vulnerability enemies, and that is going to be giving us another ton of mana back so that we can spam Icy Shards even more. Now, for the other enchantment, I did take Ice Shards enchantment so that they automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. How this works is that every single time that we freeze an enemy, it is going to passively conjure a bunch of ice shards that are going to hit them, ricochet, and pierce enemies off of them without us having to even cast it. So this is a very nice, massive, passive increase to our damage that all we need to do is freeze enemies, and we're going to be doing that anyway.